Good day, fair people of YouTube. I'm pro saxophonist Jamie Anderson. You're watching Get Your Sax Together. And on this video, which is part 4 of my complete guide to harmony for beginners, we're going to cover some advanced chordal stuff, how guide tones move, and all about extensions and how you apply that to play some nice, interesting lines when you're improvising on jazz chord sequences. So this video is the 4th part of my series on harmony. Be sure to go and check out the other 3 parts if you haven't already, because they lead up and give you all the information you need to know to get to this part, which is much more advanced. So in this part, we're going to cover guide tones. What are guide tones? Extensions. What are extensions? And I don't mean adding something to your house. And how this all works into playing really cool lines when you're improvising jazz. So in a minute, I'm going to jump behind the screen and get busy with the lesson. But first of all, please do go into the description down below and find the free PDF, which is linked down there. That's got all the information you need to help you with this lesson. And as usual, if you're enjoying the content, subscribe to the channel and ring the bell to be notified when I upload new videos. Right, I'm going to get behind the screen. See you in 2 secs. Welcome behind the screen, man. Okay, if you haven't already, I'd highly recommend that you go back and look at the first 3 videos in this series, even if you think you know it all already, as they form the foundation for this final, more advanced lesson. All these lessons can be used by players of any instrument, which is quite cool. So in part 1, we covered the basics of music theory. In part 2, we took a closer look at chords and how they're constructed and how you write symbols. And in part 3, we looked at how the chord types combine in some common functional harmony sequences. So now that we've got all that in the bag, what we're going to do now is find out what guide tones are, what extensions are, how they move through functional chord sequences, and how we can apply this to improvising on sax or any other instrument. So let's start with guide tones. What are guide tones? Guide tones are really just the notes that make up the chord that aren't the root. However, we refer to chord tones as guide tones in the context of how they move to one another as the chords change. So put another way, we call chord tones, in other words, the 3rd, 5th and 7th, etc., guide tones when we look at several chords in a row and start to piece together how these chord tones move to the chord tones of the following chord. You might say that as chords are stacked, they're vertical, whereas moving smoothly through the guide tones in several chords and gives us a nice melodic line that you might describe as horizontal. So chords are vertical, stringing together lines of guide tones gives us a horizontal line. For example, music wouldn't sound very good if we just played chords in blocks like this. So a block of D minor 7 to a block of G7 to a block of C major 7, all in root position. So what we do is we jumble up the notes of each chord and try and move to the closest note in the next chord to make things flow nice and smoothly. Maybe it's easier to look at this in actual practice. So, as always, let's keep it really simple to start and introduce rule 1, which is that 3rds move to 7ths and 7ths move to 3rds. All that means is the 3rd of one chord will become the 7th of the next chord and vice versa, which will give us pairs of smooth melodic lines through a chord sequence. For this video, let's use a 3-6-2-5-1 sequence in the home key of C to keep things nice and simple. That means the chords are E minor 7, A7, D minor 7, G7, and C major 7. So what I've done here is I've written the chord symbols and the root position 4-note chords for each chord. I've also added staves above so we can see how all these guide tones work together. So the first thing I'm going to do is put the roots of each chord in place, which is E, A, D, G, and C. Now the roots of the chords will always be played as the lowest bass note, and they don't flow in the same way as the other guide tones. The roots just move in large jumps to fit the chord sequence. The guide tones are all the other notes. So let's look at the first guide tone line, which is 3rds to 7ths. So let's add in our first guide tone line. Now the 3rd of E minor 7 is G. So we start with that, 3rds go to 7ths, so on A7 we find the 7th, which is G as well. Now we move to the 3rd of D minor 7, which is F. The 7th of G7 is F. And the 3rd of C major 7 is E. Now let's add in the partner line to that, which is going to start with the 7th of D minor 7, which is a D. And then we move to the 3rd of A7, which is C sharp. Don't know why my screen is jumping around. Then the 7th of D minor 7 is C. The 3rd of G7 is B. And the 7th of C major 7 is B. Okay, so let's see what it sounds like now with the root notes and just the 3rds and 7ths of each chord. Beautiful, and now you can see that we have these wonderful smooth lines, look, going through the chords. You might also notice this about the guide tones. They always stay the same or descend through the chords. They don't tend to go up. So if you keep going and going and they fall and fall, eventually you have to kind of hike the guide tones back up at inversion to reset the 3rds and 7ths so they can start falling again. But as you can see, look at these beautiful lines. D goes to the C sharp, to the C, to B, B, G, to the G, F, F, E. These are nice smooth lines through the chords, not like these blocky, choppy structures that just outline the root position of the chords. And that is what guide tones do. They flow smoothly through the music. So now that we've got this concept going and that's all good, let's add rule 2. And that is that 5ths move to 9ths and 9ths move to 5ths. But, whoa, hang on a minute, buddy. I know what 7ths are, but what the hell is a 9th? I thought there were only 7 notes in the scale. Good question. So let's clear this up now. As you know, chords are usually built in 3rds, from the root, 3rd, 5th, and 7th. But if we keep going up, we get into what's called the chord extensions. And these notes are the 9th, 11th, and 13th. They could just as easily be called the 2nd, 4th, and 6th, as that's what notes they are in the scale. And actually, sometimes they are called those things, which we'll cover later. But calling them the 9th, 11th, and 13th implies that these notes are higher than the 5th and 7th and should be approached that way musically. As we'll see later, these extensions, as they're called, the 9th, 11th, and 13th, can be modified with flats or sharps to add colour to our chord sequences. For the moment, let's just say that the 9th of the chord is the same note as the 2nd note of the scale, so it's nice and easy to find. So, for example, here we have C major 7, C, E, G, B, and if you want to add the 9th, well, what's the 2nd note of C major? It's D. So we add the D at the top, and that gives us the 9th. And then there's the 11th, which is F, and the 13th, which is A. Okay, cool. So let's go back to rule 2 now. 9ths move to 5ths, and 5ths move to 9ths. And let's apply it to our example. So the 9th of E minor 7 is F sharp. Every time I put notes in, the screen jumps. Sorry about that. And then we go to the 5th of A7, which is E. Then we go to the 9th of D minor 7, which is E. And we go to the 5th of G7, which is D. And then finally we have the 9th of C major 7, which is D. So there we have the first line of our second batch of guide tones, which is going 9ths to 5ths. So now let's add the 5ths to 9ths to go with it. So the 5th of E minor 7 is B. The 9th of A7 is B. The 5th of D minor 7 is A. The 9th of G7 is A. And the 5th of C major 7 is G. Okay, now then, I've tried to do a little bit of crafty color coding here. So let's now put together the bass notes, which are in this kind of orange gold color, the 3rds and the 7ths, which are all green, and the 9ths and the 5ths, which are now blue. Let's hear what this all sounds like. And you can see the notes light up on the piano with all the different guide tone lines. Here we go. Pretty damn awesome. Right, seeing as we're on a roll, Let's up the ante and add a new chord type that we didn't cover in part 3, and that's called a half diminished or minor 7 flat 5 chord. So the minor 7 flat 5 name pretty much tells you everything you need to know here. It does what it says on the tin. You take a minor 7 chord and you flatten the 5th. This is the first time that we've seen that 5th adjusted so far, and the way we would describe the chord is root, minor 3rd, flat 5, flat 7. So if we were in E, the root would be E, minor 3rd is G, flattened 5th is B flat, and flat 7 is D. And it looks like that. A pretty cool chord. The chord symbol for a minor 7 flat 5 is either just the same as minor 7 with a flat 5 written after it, or you can write it like this, which is a circle with a line through it. That means half diminished. The chord symbol for a diminished chord is a circle. So cutting the circle in half tells us that it's a half diminished chord, although that's all for a later day. So you can either have a circle cut in half like that diagonally, or you can just have E minor 7 flat 5. Most commonly, we use minor 7 flat 5s as the 2 chord of a 2-5-1 to a minor key. So where a 2-5-1 to C major would be D minor 7, G7, C major 7, a 2-5-1 to C minor would be D minor 7 flat 5, G7, C minor. Now that we know that, we can replace our E minor 7 chord in our example to an E minor 7 flat 5, as it really functions as a temporary 2-5-1 to D minor in this sequence. So let's now go to our guide tones and change the 5th of E minor 7 to the flat 5th. So there's the 5th. Let's make that flat. So now we've got our half diminished chord. And so now that sounds like this. Okay, so the first thing that we notice is it's a bit jarry the way that that B flat then goes to the B natural in the next chord. And this brings us on nicely to the next point. In a minor 2-5-1, the 5 dominant chord sounds better with altered extension notes. In this case, we can flatten the B, which is the 9th of A7, flatten that 9th, which gives us a smoother top line to the D minor 7. So look, let's take that B natural there, which is the 9th of A7, and we're going to make it a B flat to flatten it. Now let's see how that affects how this chord sequence sounds. Slightly smoother into that D minor 7 so far. However, I don't know about you, but I think the F sharp, that natural 9th on the minor 7 flat 5, is a little bit jarring as well. So let's momentarily break our 9th to 5th rule and use the root instead of the 5th, just as a one-off here. So let's take that 9th and move it down to an E instead. And let's see what that sounds like now. Aha, now it's sounding much better already. Much smoother line through to that D minor 7. Okay, finally, let's experiment with altering some other extensions and add a new modification to our 9ths to 5ths rule. So 9ths or roots move to 5ths or 13ths. That's how we can modify the rule. So the basic rule is 9ths move to 5ths, but now we can also add to that rule 9ths or roots move to 5ths or 13ths. Now we haven't talked about the 13ths yet. In other words, we can develop our basic 5ths to 9ths rule to add more colour. Okay, let's see how this could work. You'll notice that our roots, 3rds and 7ths always stay the same. If I just scroll up a bit, look. These green notes and the gold notes, they stay fixed through all that because that's the foundation of the harmony. And then we tinker with these blue extension notes at the top. So as a first variation, let's change the 5th of our A7 to a sharpened 5th. So look, there's E, which is the 5th of A7 here. Let's make that sharp. Now, I know that's an E sharp, which is the same as F natural. You could also call it the flat 13th. In fact, maybe it'll look a bit easier if we do that. So let's change it to F, which is the flat 13 of A7. Okay, we've changed the 5th of A7 to a sharp 5th or flat 13, same difference. Let's see what that sounds like now. Oh, that's nice. So now we're getting some pretty cool sounds going on. So as a second variation, now let's look at this note here. This is the 5th of G7. Let's bump that up to the 13th. Remember, the 13th is the same as the 6th. Let's see how that sounds now that we've changed that little extension. Aha, nice. So now we're really getting some beautiful sounds. Through experimentation and using your ears, you'll quickly find out what sounds good and what doesn't. We've already found that natural ninths sound a little bit juicy on a -7 flat 5, and that flat 9s on -7 chords probably sound pretty terrible if you've ever tried that. So you need to avoid that. The main payoffs with extensions always happen on the 7 chords, and you can have pretty much any combination of flat or sharp 9 or 13 or 5th. My personal favourite is to have a 13 flat 9. So let's put that in our finished example now. So here's our G7 chord. We've got the 9th and the 13th. Let's take that A and let's flatten it. So now we've got G13 flat 9. Let's put that in the sequence and see how that sounds. Here we go. That's working nicely. D minor 9. Ooh, awesome. And finally, let's just do one more change and we'll take the 5th of C major 7 and move it up to the 13th or the 6th. And let's see how that sounds. I'm loving this chord sequence now. Here we go. Yeah, so we're getting that really nice dense harmony now on the C major 7 chord. This is all absolutely fantastic, but what's the point of it all? First of all, the first point, you can use your newfound knowledge to arrange for multiple horns or instruments. For example, if we take our example here, add a bit of rhythm to these chords, and then give each guide tone, like you can see the guide tones, the 2 in green and the 2 in blue, if we give each of them to a separate saxophone, so for example, we give the root notes in gold, we give them to baritone sax. If we put these 2 green notes on tenor, and we put the bottom blue note on alto and the top blue note on soprano, and then we add a little bit of a more swingy type stabs rhythm to it, we could end up with something that looks like this. And through the wonders of modern technology, I've popped off to record all those parts, and it ends up sounding something like this. And you can look at the score for that in the free PDF down there in the description. So that's the first point we can take away from this guide tone writing. You can use your newfound skills to distribute those notes skillfully across a range of instruments. The second take-home point of all this is that you can take these guide tone lines and apply them to your improvising. If you take each guide tone line, you can use it to help carve out a nice melodic line through chord changes without having to zip up and down the chord arpeggios the whole time. So instead of arpeggiating the chords vertically like this, you could take the guide tone lines that you've studied and hinge your lines off them to make something more melodic, like this. And again, you can find the transcription for those little examples in the free PDF. Whew, so that is it. That's the end of the 4th part of this series. We have learned a massive amount. You've literally gone from zero, from what sound waves are and how music is organized through keys, chords, chord symbols, how chord symbols link up, how you describe them, into what chord tones are, guide tones, extensions, and how all this applies to playing wicked lines. That is a lot of information, my friend. So make sure you go back and watch all these videos again if you need to. Be sure to go down into the description to get the linked PDF, which has got some great information to accompany the video, and subscribe to the channel, and please do ring that notifications bell, and that way you'll be told when I upload new videos. So hope you enjoyed the content, and I'll see you next time on Get Your Sax Together.